Thank you. Nice to see you. Nice to see all you beautiful Californians in a relatively crime-free zone. So Tammy outlined a couple of projects that this essay app that my son has been working on with me. We've been working on that for about 4 years, and as she pointed out, the goal was to help people write, but that's not really the goal. The goal is to help people formulate their thoughts. And if you think about writing the way people typically think about writing, you think about the writing as what you produce. It's like the end product, but that's not really the issue. The issue is it would be good to be able to think. Why? Well, a great philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, said, the purpose of thought is to allow your thoughts to die instead of you. Right? And it's a really profound statement, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. So, the way that organisms adapt to change in the natural world is partly through learning, let's say, but it's also through genetic variation, right? So, mosquito pair has thousands of offspring. Each of them differs slightly for a variety of reasons. Most of them die. And if they didn't, we'd be knee-deep in mosquitoes in no time. And so on average, about as many mosquitoes survive as were there before. But there's variation. And so the variations that aren't suited to the current environment don't propagate. Well, people do that too because we vary genetically, but at some point in the course of our evolutionary history, we developed the capacity to abstract. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what's at the core of that ability? What is it in its essence? What is the ability to think? You might say, well, it's the ability to manipulate facts. And that's peripherally true. It's not the central issue. The central issue is that the part of your brain that formulates abstractions grew out of the part of your brain that governs your actions and directs your perceptions. It's the motor cortex. So the motor cortex sequences your actions, right? It's the part of your brain you use when you move voluntarily. And what grew out of that over the course of evolution was the prefrontal cortex. And what the prefrontal cortex does is produce virtual representations of potential action patterns. Just like it's the same thing that happens in some real sense when you have an avatar in a video game. Because the video game is a fictional world, and you can play out various strategies in a video game, and if your strategy fails, then your avatar dies, and that is somewhat unpleasant, but in all probability, nowhere as unpleasant as actually dying. And the same applies in principle to your thoughts, is that you can produce virtual variants of your future self. You can imagine how they might manage themselves across time. You can talk to other people about that and see if they have any criticisms that you might listen to before you implement the avatar in your actual life. And if you're careful and imaginative and sophisticated in your critical analysis, then you can dream up the you that would do better, and you can dispense with the erroneous variants before you die, and then you can implement them. And so then you might say, well, that's why you think, because it's better than suffering stupidly and dying pointlessly. And then you might ask, well, how do you think? And one answer is, well, you can use your imagination, right? I mean, your visual imagination. That's what happens, for example, when you dream. And when you're dreaming, you're actually playing with virtual avatars. What happens is that when you fall asleep and you enter the dream state, you're actually paralyzed. The only part of your body that can move is your eyes. And it doesn't matter if you move your eyes, because you're not going to get in trouble by moving your eyes. But if you run around while you're dreaming and run into a wall, which happens to animals, by the way, if scientists remove the part of their brain that blocks their motor activity when they're dreaming, then they can get in all sorts of trouble when they're playing with the variations that constitute the space of dreams. That's the same as the space of imagination. It's the space that fiction emerges out of. It's the space that games emerge out of, right? And it's a place where experimentation can take place. That's part of thought. And a deeply engrossing and realistic form of thought. And then one level of abstraction above that is the thought that takes place in words. And words, in some sense, words are abstracted representations of images of action. That's a good way of thinking about it. They're not labels for things. It's easy to think that, but it's not exactly right. They're abstracted representations of images of action patterns. And so, if you can think verbally, you can produce abstractions effectively and efficiently and cull them properly before you implement them. And so one of the real reasons to learn to write is so that you can learn to think, so that you don't suffer stupidly and die prematurely. And this isn't explained well to people about their writing. It's certainly not, I don't think it was ever explained to any students I ever encountered. It's like, well, why do you write? To finish the assignment. It's like, no, it's to straighten out your brain. And so one of the things I noticed when I was reading student essays was that they're often cliched and dull. And that was like one of 50 problems, but 2 of 50 problems. And one of the things I told my students asked them, were you bored by this assignment? Say, yeah, kind of. It's like, you think you were bored writing it. You should be the person who has to read something written by someone who is bored by what they wrote. It's like, and so what's the problem with being bored by what you wrote? Well, the problem is it's a lie. The whole thing's a lie. It's like, you don't care about what you wrote about. Oh, good. I can hardly wait to read it. So then you might think, well, what should you write about? It's like, how about something you care about? How about that? How about you pick a question that's like a burning question, right? Something that really grips you, something that bugs you. And that's an interesting thing to think about too, the fact that certain things bother you. And you might think, I wish nothing bothered me. It's like, no, you don't really, because if nothing bothered you, in some sense, that would be the same thing as not caring about anything. It actually turns out to be the case that the things that bug you are the things that you care about when they go wrong. And so then this is a really useful question to ask yourself, because you might be observing the political landscape and you think, that really bugs me. And maybe you annoy the hell out of your friends and your enemies and even yourself by, being obsessively concerned about that thing that bugs you. And then you might ask yourself, well, why does that bug you? Because there's like a million things that could, in principle, bother you. And, maybe you're one of those people that has a million things bothering you, but probably not. There's more things that don't bother you than that do bother you, because there's a lot of things. And if everything bothered you, you'd just die. All right, so there's very selective things that bother you. And it's very interesting, because in some sense, they choose you. Because you might say something like, I wish that didn't bother me. It's like, that's a very strange thing to say, because it begs the question, why then does that bother you? And also, why can't you control it, right? That's a very, this is part of the reason I loved reading the psychoanalysts, because the psychoanalysts knew, they're the first people who really cottoned onto this in a kind of technically sophisticated manner. They knew that we were, in part, collections of autonomous subpersonalities, and that those subpersonalities could take control of us. And that's really what happens when something bugs you. It's something autonomous, that has a will and an agency, takes control of you and forces you to attend, despite yourself sometimes. And why should you attend? Because that's your destiny calling you, right? That's your problem. And that's a good thing to know, because people ask themselves, where do I find the meaning in my life? I would say, well, are there things that bother you? Yes, those are your problems. And you might say, well, I don't want those to be my problems. Like, hey, did someone ask you? It's just how it happens. And so then, why is that relevant to writing? Why don't you write about something that bothers you and try to figure it out? Because you've got to ask yourself, well, first of all, what would your life be like if you actually addressed the things that bothered you, right? And say, well, political things bother me. It's like, maybe you have a political duty that's calling to you. I mean, why not? Someone has to, and you're a citizen. Could be you, and not just an interest, right? And not just an obsession, but an obligation and a responsibility. And God only knows what would happen if you pursue that. I was talking to Mike Johnson, who's the fourth most powerful Republican in Washington. About 3 days ago, we were talking about the potential for young people to be involved in the political sphere. And in our culture, appallingly, most youth involvement comes in the form of protest. And that's the fault of the idiot universities, as far as I can tell, because basically what students are taught is that if something bothers them, which it might, then they should protest about it. It's like, well, you could do something about it instead of complaining about the people who are doing something. And the thing, I don't want to be cynical about that, because you can do something about it. That's one of the wonderful things, let's say, about your country, is you actually could do something about it. And you think, well, who would listen to me? It's like, well, maybe not this second, and I checked with Mike to see if this was still the case, because my experience when I was young was that I joined a political party when I was very young, and I did the things that you do when you first engage with an organization like that, which is what you're asked to do. But if you do those things, this works in any organization, by the way, if you get a job and then you do the job well, then if you're working for someone who isn't out of their mind, in which case you should get another job, then they're actually pretty happy that you did the job. And if another opportunity comes along and they don't know what to do with it, they might think, well, that person did the job, I could give it to them. And then doors open, and that's how it works. And it does work like that. And if you're in an organization where it doesn't work like that, you should go to some other organization, because you're not in a good organization. It's not going to succeed because it doesn't reward the people who do their job. And how in the world is it going to succeed if it fails to do that? And if you're cynical about that, well, either you're in the wrong organization or you're not doing your job, right? And it could be either of those, or even some combination of both. But if you joined a political party to address the things that bother you, and you work diligently at it, you'd find that doors would open for you like mad. And then another thing that I've also come to realize that's worth thinking about too, I talked a bit to Mike about this, is that something bothers you, it bugs you, and so that's your problem, and therefore your responsibility. And you might say, well, I don't want to shoulder that responsibility. And maybe that's true and maybe it isn't. Like, it would take some work, and so you could see that you might be disinclined to do the work, although it might be interesting, especially because it does bother you and you are interested in it, so it might be a good thing. But if you don't take that responsibility and you abdicate it, then exactly the people that you do not want to have govern your life will take that responsibility from you, and that will become their power. Right, and so part of the reason that it might bug you to begin with is because you get a little glimmering of an advancing tyranny, and that tyranny, at least in part, is proportional to your failure to fully manifest your responsibility in regard to your concerns. And so with regard to writing, it's like, well, if you're going to write, which is to think, if you're going to spend your time to communicate, then maybe you should pick something important. And then maybe if you picked something important, you'd write and think through something you need to be able to think through. And maybe when you thought it through, you'd help the people who were reading it think it through, and that would be of collective benefit. And maybe by thinking it through, you would put your house in order more. You know, there's an idea that lurks at the bottom of our culture, the bottom of Western culture, that the Word is divine, right? And that the Word is God made flesh, even. That's a very, very strange idea. But it implies that there's something transcendently valuable about the Word. And given that the Word is the manner in which you bring alternate versions of yourself into being and test them for their viability before you implement them, if you don't want to suffer and die stupidly, and that well thought through plans literally rearrange the world and transform possibility into actuality and maybe into beneficial actuality, it's not so unreasonable to put forward the proposition that insofar as anything is sacred, which means deep and fundamental above all else, then that's the case with words. And so that's why you should write, because writing is a formalized mode of thinking. And if you think carefully, then you can address your concerns, and if you address your concerns properly, then you can bear your responsibility. And if you bear your responsibility, then maybe you'll have the adventure of your life, and you'll put your house in order and be a credit to your society. And that's actually what people should be learning at university. That's what the humanities were there forever to teach people. And, you know, now they're there to teach people that Western culture is a corrupt patriarchy and everything should burn. And that's not a very good idea unless you want to dance around in the flames. And, you know, that might be fun for a minute or two, because it's an appeal to resentment, you know, and envy. And you might think those bastards had it coming. But you'll find out very soon that you're one of the bastards that had it coming. And generally, that's not very pleasant. And so that's a little disquisition on why we built the essay app, right? To help people think. Because the alternative to thinking is gloomy indeed. I'll tell you one more thing about thinking. One of the things you see that characterizes bad writing is the use of cliches or slogans. And a slogan is a thought that many people utter, let's say. And maybe it has some emotional compulsion behind it, but it's a slogan, right? It's a pseudo-thought in some sense, certainly not original. It's not part of a real attempt to explore and understand. It's part of an attempt to explain away, often for unexpressed moral reasons. What does slogan mean? Well, the word is derived from two Welsh words, sluag, S-L-U-A-G-H, and gairm, G-H-A-I-R-M. Sluag, gairm, battle cry of the dead. So just think about that the next time you utter a slogan. Just exactly what subset of personalities has grip on your communication. The resentful dead, speaking through you, right? Inviting everyone else to join them. And so you want to write in an original manner, an honest manner, because otherwise you're spouting slogans. And then you're an avatar of the resentful dead. And maybe they're not so happy about the fact that you're alive either. So, one more thing I want to tell you about what's coming up. On November 25th, some of you may find this interesting and worthwhile. You know, about 5 years ago, I did a series of lectures on Genesis, and those proved to be, well, I really liked doing them. I think I did 16 of them, something like that, and they were quite, thank you. It was a surprising thing to do. It was the first time that I had endeavored to lecture in this manner publicly. You know, I taught a lot of university courses and spoken at conferences and that sort of thing, but we decided at that point to take a risk and rent a theater in Toronto, because I knew that young men would flock to hear some old bastard talk about the Bible. So it's a great business plan, and in any case, it worked. So who would have expected that? And a lot of people have watched those lectures, and a lot of religious people from all sorts of different faiths, you know, which has been extremely interesting. It's really interesting to see that, but a lot of atheists too, and they're acolytes of a different faith. So, although they don't think that, but it's still true. And ever since then, and well, even then, I wanted to continue walking through the biblical corpus, let's say, although I wasn't able to do that for quite a long time. But about 2 months ago, I invited 8 of the smartest people I've met, and I've been very fortunate because I've been able to meet some of the world's smartest people. You know, with my podcast and my traveling, I've been able to identify people who are super sharp, and I identified a group of people. Some of them were biblical scholars. Some of them you know. Dennis Prager was part of the group. Yeah. He was our token hyper-intellectual Jew. Which is good, because we did a seminar on Exodus, right? And it's good to have someone steeped in the Jewish tradition to help guide the way through that ancient story. And so anyways, I brought these 8 people together, and we spent 8 evenings, 2 hours an evening, walking through the first half of the story of Exodus. And Jonathan Pageau was there. He was a major contributor. Yeah, if you don't know about Pageau, if you like my lectures, you might think about checking out Pageau, because he's one of the deepest thinkers I've ever met. Very, very sharp, Russian Orthodox adherent, an artist, a very good artist, in the classic medieval tradition. He can actually make a living at that, which is quite the miracle. He's an icon carver. I think he's like the only French-Canadian Orthodox Christian entrepreneurial icon carver, and he's certainly the only one who's also an expert in postmodern theory. And so, which makes him a particularly deadly person, because he knows his enemy, let's say, inside and out, and he's a very profound person. Anyways, James Orr was there. James is a professor of divinity at Cambridge, and so was Douglas Headley, who's another professor there. Stephen Blackwood, who's president of this Ralston College, which is a new university that I'm involved in Savannah. A friend, an old student of mine, Greg Hurwitz, super sharp guy, more on the liberal end of things, curse his miserable heart, but very, 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 very bright, and a writer of extremely popular thrillers. And he helped analyze the story of Exodus from the perspective of plot and characterization, and so that was extremely interesting. And there were other people there who were of equal intellectual significance. Os Guinness, he's written about, I think, 20 books. He's the heir of the Guinness Stout fortune, by the way, just as a side gig in some sense. And we're going to reconvene in January to finish the series, and Ben Shapiro is going to participate this time, so I'm pretty thrilled about that. And so is Douglas Murray. And so that'll be good. Yeah. So anyways, we had these people gathered together, and we walked through this first half of this book. And if you like the Genesis series, you'll like this series. And it's going to be released by the Daily Wire Plus people on November 25th. And they helped me put it together. It was an expensive undertaking to get all those people together for a whole week in one place and to do the filming professionally. And so they made that possible. And we're all looking. Exodus means ex-hodos, and ex-hodos means the way forward. And you could think of the Exodus story as an eternally valid representation of the way forward. And so what do I mean by eternally valid? And I mean something like it's relevant no matter the time or place. And I think that's a characteristic of a deep story. In fact, I think that's what we mean when we say a story is deep, right? Because we do have a sense that there are deep stories and shallow stories, right? You know when you're watching a shallow story, it's fluffy, it's light. Those are the metaphors used. Doesn't matter. It's just cheap entertainment. It's insignificant, although it might be momentarily amusing. And the fact that it's momentarily amusing is also an indication of its lack of depth, because when you do things that are only momentarily amusing, you're not being very deep, as you know, which is why you say it's only momentarily amusing. It's only relevant right now. And whereas profound story, it shakes you to the core, right? It's another metaphor of depth. It moves things in the deep, right? It's moving. It's significant, and maybe overwhelmingly so. And it's very interesting to contemplate what makes a story shallow and what makes a story deep. And here's a conceptual tool. So imagine that as you move down the hierarchy of depth in the world of narrative, you move from the profane to the religious, right? By definition. I'm not making a case for anything religious. I'm trying to provide a definition. When we talk about what's sacred, what we mean is what's deep in the hierarchy of significance. And so some stories are deep stories, and the stories that we regard as great works of literature are great precisely because they have that depth. And they have that depth because they're about many things at once. That's a way of thinking about it. And they're about many relevant things at once. And they're about many relevant things independent of situation at once. And the greater the story, the more that's true. And the Exodus story is great in exactly that way. And it's great partly because it puts forward first, in some sense, a picture of the existential state of human beings psychologically and socially. And so what's part of the existential state of human beings psychologically and socially? Well, one transcendent truth, you might say, is that we all have to confront the reality of death. And so stories that help us do that are deep and profound because they help all of us deal with something that we all have to deal with no matter when we're born or in what situation. And in the Exodus story, it's not exactly death that's the issue, although it's lurking in the background, as it always is. It's more the eternal battle, the eternal struggle between slavery, tyranny, and freedom. And that problem never goes away. You can enslave yourself with your own tyranny, right? And of course, we do that to ourselves all the time. And when we all do that, then we have an actual tyranny, because it is the case that in tyrannical states, the state is tyrannical not because there's a tyrannical leader and everyone else is striving to be free. It's because the tyranny is completely distributed and every single person in the entire state does nothing but lie to themselves willingly all the time. And not just to themselves, but to everyone they love. I toured through Eastern Europe earlier this year, and I suppose the most cardinal example of that was Albania, which was the worst of the Soviet states. Now there's a flag to fly, right? Because that's a rough competition. And it's pretty difficult to get to the bottom of that. But Albania managed it. And in Albania, as was also the case in East Germany, at least 1 out of every 3 people was an informer for the state. And so you just imagine what that meant. That meant if you had a family of 6, 2 of your family members were reporting every single thing you said to people who wanted nothing more than to find something that you said that was inappropriate so they could torture you. And so you think, well, how does a totalitarian state maintain itself given people's love of freedom? It's like, well, 1 out of 3 people informs on their family and friends to the very state that's tyrannizing them, right? And so, of course, in a situation like that, well, do you lie all the time? Well, obviously. And that actually doesn't excuse it because, well, there are consequences to that, and the consequences is you produce hell around you, and God only knows how long it lasts. And so, anyways, it's in the analysis of such things that you see that the relationship between tyranny and slavery and freedom is a constant and chronic existential concern. And part of what the Exodus story does is map out the proper relationship between those 3 states of being. I'll give you some hints about that are useful. So, God calls on Moses to confront the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh is the archetypal tyrant. And God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh something very specific. And this is repeated multiple times in the text. And so you could think of God in this story as the voice that calls the enslaved to freedom and the voice that calls the tyrant out. Okay, so it's a characterization of the highest possible animating spirit. And so it's a hypothesis. Part of the nature of the highest possible animating spirit is the voice that calls the enslaved to be free and that calls out the action of tyrants. And then you can ask yourself, as you should, whether or not you believe in the existence of that spirit. And the way to decide whether you believe that is to ask yourself, do you believe that there is a voice, a transcendent voice in some sense, that calls the tyrant out? And you can ask that yourself, that relationship to your own conscience. If you're being a tyrant, isn't there part of you that knows it and calls you out on it? Now, you might ignore that. Maybe you haven't established a very effective dialogue with that spirit, so to speak, but it's not like you don't know it. And it's not like you don't know it's wrong. Now, sometimes you don't, because we're ignorant as well as willfully blind, but you get my point. And then you also ask yourself, well, do you think there's something intrinsically wrong with slavery? And everyone says, well, of course. It's like, no, not of course. That's not the issue here. If I can force you to do something, why shouldn't I? Why don't I have the right to? Why isn't the fact that I'm able and willing to use compulsion on you full justification for whatever I want to do? You might object, well, people have intrinsic worth. It's like, fair enough, but that's a religious axiom, you know. So it's predicated on the idea, and it is historically predicated on this idea, and the historical pathway is absolutely clear, by the way. This isn't disputable. The reason that your country is predicated on the self-evidence of the inviolate dignity of the individual is because it's predicated on a literary tradition, a narrative tradition, that's founded on the assumption that men and women were made in the image of God. That's why. And then you have to ask yourself, well, do you believe that? Well, that is why. It's not even a religious claim. And it's a historically valid claim, and it's a surprising claim, because for most of human history, the idea that I'm better than you if I can force you to do what I want that's just how it was, right? That was the self-justification of power. If you're weak and useless and I can compel you, I'm strong and powerful. How am I not better than you? And the answer is something like, well, true sovereignty